Okay, I think we are about to start. So if everyone can get into their positions. And ladies and gentlemen, if you can find your seats. Thank you.
Welcome. We are honored to open the International Mock Trial on Human Rights. Before we begin, we need to point out a critical note. Today's trial is not real. However, everything you hear and see today is based on verifiable evidence and written and researched by historians. The man on trial today never faced the court of law. He never made to answer for the murderous acts he facilitated and condoned, nor did he have to face the consequences of the role that he played supporting the genocidal policies of the Nazis. Part 2 of lack of evidence at the time, which we now have, and in part due of the prosecution's strategy. But while this trial did not happen, and the man who portrays Ernst Rudin is an actor, the man Ernst Rudin was very real. And while he never found a single shred of scientific evidence to back up his racial hygiene ideology, he did not hesitate to promote it with full force and authority of actual science for his personal bias. Why hold a mock trial? Because through exposing the injustices Ernst Rudin brought about, some form of justice is restored. It is the justice of acknowledging the irrefuable fact of what took place in Nazi Germany, who the perpetrators and collaborators were, and never forgetting the victims. We, young leaders from all over the world, are not here today only to restore historical justice. We are here to create an effect, to inspire, to warn of the danger of racism in all its form and the terrible consequences of classifying and discriminating against people on the basis of disability, religious affiliation, genetic or ethnic belonging, or any other arbitrary reason. We are here today because it is important to us to make the world recognize and respect the diversity and uniqueness of each and every one of us, and to make everyone work hard to strengthen international solidarity for the great of human rights. After all, we are all one living human family.
We, the mock trial team, hailing from 10 different countries and representing a diversity of nationalities, religions, ethnicities, and beliefs from around the world, dedicate this trial to the memory of all those who perished in the Holocaust and all the people who suffered genocide and persecution on the basis of their differences. We wish to convey an unequivocal and clear message to everyone in the world that humanity has a multi-generational memory. And all those who violated human rights will be remembered and brought to justice even after many decades have passed. I'm honored to welcome my members of the team of litigators of the International Mock Trial on Human Rights. I'm honored to welcome Ms. Melissa Fleming, Under Secretary General for Global Communications, to offer welcoming remarks.
I'm so pleased to join you here this afternoon, and welcome to United Nations headquarters. I know that some of you have traveled, and you just mentioned, far and wide to be here for this trial. For this mock trial, as you clarified. Mock trial, but with enormous significance and symbolism. I really salute your commitment, all of you, to this project and to engaging so intensively with this very challenging history, the history of the perpetrators who were never put on trial. Today's program is part of a longer calendar of events that are organized by the Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program, which is part of the Department of Global Communications, the department that I lead. The United Nations considers words and actions to be inseparable. What one says is much of an action as what one does. In 2005, the United Nations member states instructed that the 27th of January would be the International Day the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And they also established the outreach program to mobilize civil society for Holocaust remembrance and education in order to prevent any future genocide. Think about this. A UN resolution that was passed in 2005 was only words, but these words have the power to make the history of the Holocaust a part of the international stage, and also to welcome you here today. Our outreach program puts into action the words expressed. Thus, for this year, the program organized also 3 exhibitions that are on display here at the United Nations, and I hope that in the course of your time here, you're able to see them. They're incredibly moving and fascinating, and provide different angles of what happened before, during, and after the Holocaust. The program also organized a ceremony that took place on the 27th, on Friday, and over 1,000 people attended in the audience in the General Assembly Hall, and it was also live streamed around the world. And today's event allows your work and the hard work of the Social Excellence Forum to be shared also with the world. Coming up, we'll also be meeting with this next week with the filmmaker Ken Burns and also Lynn Novick and the historian Daniel Green to talk about the film, which is called The U.S. and the Holocaust. It's available for free to view on PBS, the U.S. Public Broadcasting System. But also the week after that, we will hold a discussion about social media and the Holocaust and the horrific phenomenon that we're seeing online of rising anti-Semitism and also even denial of the Holocaust. And that's just at the beginning of the year, and all these actions, these words, illustrate the United Nations commitment to counter anti-Semitism and hate speech and to support all actions taken to protect the right of all to a life lived with dignity and peace. So, why does this project that you're all working on so hard matter to the United Nations? Some of the reasons are obvious, and perhaps some are less so. First of all, it matters, of course, that we know what happened and that we're able to counter lies and distortion of the history with the verifiable evidence that exists. It also matters that we know of the danger of racism and anti-Semitism that lay at the heart of Nazi ideology in order to counter the racism and anti-Semitism that unfortunately still persists today. We need to know what happened when the scientists chose ideology over the search for truth, when those who were trained to care and to heal were blinded by a murderer's ideology and chose career advancement promised by obedience to the Nazi regime over their ethical responsibility and over their very humanity. This project is important because it allows you to show that your generation, one more generation away from the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, is seeking justice through education. Your work here today and over the past year is a statement of commitment to what is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all humans, without exemption, are worthy of life, are born with the right to live lives with dignity and in peace. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the milestone document that captured the aspirations and values of humanity following the horrors of World War II, is also celebrating its 75th year this year. All of your hard work that brought you here today is a tribute to all of those lives that were lost as a result of the Holocaust. And for this work, you share in the goals of the United Nations, and that is to build a world in which all people can live with dignity and in peace. And for that, and so much more, we thank you and wish you insightful deliberations.
It's now my honor to call His Excellency Mr. Gilad Erdan, the permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations, to share welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Shira Khan. It is deeply inspiring for me to meet young Israeli leaders like yourself. Kol hakavod. She deserves a round of applause. Yeah. Keep up the great work. I will begin by thanking Undersecretary General Melissa Fleming and, of course, the United Nations Outreach Program on the Holocaust for its important work. I would also like to thank Dr. Avi Omer and his amazing initiative, the Social Forum for Excellence. As well, yeah, he deserves it. As well as the honorable justices, among them Justice Rubinstein, a former vice president of Israel's Supreme Court, who have joined us today. But most importantly, I would like to thank our team of young litigators. When I look at you, I don't see youth. I see future leaders. I see empowered young adults who are driven to make an impact. And for that, you all deserve a round of applause. Thank you very much. Delegates, students, friends, today we are convening to hold a mock trial for Ernst Rudin, a Nazi who escaped justice despite committing the most heinous of crimes. This event represents rectification of a colossal wrong. It represents how history should have played out. The students here have spent many hours, both virtually and in person, studying, researching, and preparing for this moment. But this learning experience is not only about what happens in the classroom, but rather what happens here in the courtroom. Although this is a mock trial, it nonetheless teaches us a profound lesson. Educating ourselves is important. Vocally standing up for human rights is crucial, but change is not the result of verbal commitments. Change is the result of actions. This is the key component of leadership: taking action, being proactive. When faced with injustice and bigotry, silence is never an option. But while speaking up for what is right is a good first step, becoming an agent of change requires getting your hands dirty. Just look at what is going on today in Iran. The Iranian people, especially the women, have suffered decades of oppression. Yet, despite the life-threatening danger of standing up to such a ruthless regime, they have taken to the streets to protest their unjust reality, to make their oppressors understand that they will no longer suffer in silence. Now, in contrast, look at Germany during the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. Despite the brutality, suffering, and violence endured by so many, including Germans, so few stood up against them. The majority of Germans preferred to be accomplices in the greatest crime in the history of humanity. This is not what leaders do. When faced with evil, leaders take action, just like you students are doing today. You are taking the tools that you learned in the ivory tower, and you are using them to fight an unspeakable act of evil in the courtroom. Fighting and convicting, these are verbs. These are words of action. But, dear students, this mock trial is only the beginning. Tragically, today, as we all know, anti-Semitism is on the rise. As the number of Holocaust survivors dwindle, there are those that, as a result of sickening Jew hatred, seek to erase their stories, to erase this darkest stain on humanity, as well as any lessons learned from this greatest tragedy. Yet, those that commit this abominable act know that they cannot claim that the crematoria did not exist at all, or that the Holocaust was a complete lie. The evidence is there, and it is indisputable. So, what do? Holocaust denial mutated into Holocaust distortion. And what do these bigots claim? Yes, they say, many people died, but 6 million? Jews were killed, but systematic genocide? The Jews indeed were targeted, but did they not bring it upon themselves? In this age, when the Holocaust is becoming a distant memory, fiction is now becoming fact. And if these falsehoods become accepted, the lessons of the Holocaust will disappear forever. But friends, these falsehoods are now becoming commonplace, and the way they proliferate at such terrifying speeds, and you know it better than anyone else, is through the internet and social media. We here at the UN identified this, and as leaders, we took a proactive approach. 1 year ago, here at the UN, I led a historic resolution dedicated to combating Holocaust denial and distortion on social media platforms. This resolution, only the second UN resolution to ever be initiated by Israel, finally holds these platforms accountable for the hate spewed across them. Remember, when fighting the forces of evil, words are not enough. Leaders take action. The younger generation has the ability to influence the future. You all have the power, particularly when it comes to social media, to make an impact, for better or for worse. As history has taught us, hateful words always turn into hateful actions. It is our responsibility to actively combat this rising bigotry. So students, you are the next generation of leaders, so it is your responsibility to speak out against hatred, but also to act against it. This mock trial is proof that the leaders of tomorrow will never forget the crimes of today's bigots, that they will be hunted down and brought to justice no matter how long it takes, no matter. This is a generation of proactive leaders who will fight hatred tooth and nail. And this is precisely the message each of you is sending today. A message of action, a message of a brighter tomorrow. And truly, I am so proud of you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
It's now my honor to call on Ms. Marija Vasilieva Blasev, Special Advisor in the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy in Youth. Welcome.
Thank you, Shira Khan. I hope you can hear me well. This is a good height. Excellencies, distinguished guests, youth, young leaders, it is my great pleasure to be with you here today at this international mock trial on human rights in the United Nations headquarters. It's actually very wonderful to see a room buzzing with life and, energy. I'll start by just saying very simple facts. For example, that our world today is home to 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 and 24, the largest generation of young people in its history. And close to 90% of this population group lives in the developing countries. These numbers are expected to continue to grow, especially in the least developed countries. In this reality, I think it is and should be clear to everybody that sustainable development and peace cannot be achieved unless we involve young people all over the world in their all diversity to create a condition and conditions that allow them to reach their full potential. Your participation today is an important illustration of how young people can engage with the past so that the contemporary world, and most importantly also the future, do not repeat humanity's mistakes, but allows everyone the opportunity to thrive and realize their human rights. So thank you very much for all your hard work and the commitment to this very important work. We must speak out and stand up whenever we witness hate, violence, discrimination. As part of this initiative, you're also learning how to be ethical leaders, leaders that understand the weight of the responsibility that comes with their position. It is a responsibility to others, not to oneself, to the most vulnerable, not to those already in power and privilege. Through this mock trial at the United Nations headquarters, you have made an important mark on the continuous process of building the architecture of international justice around deterrence, prevention, and accountability for the Holocaust and other mass atrocities. Thank you for your commitment to justice and for building a better, more peaceful world. Thank you and wish you wonderful discussions.
I'm very blessed now to call in Dr. Avi Omer. Dr. Omer is the chair and the founder of the Social Excellence Forum, who conceived and executed this mock trial project.
Thank you. Well, after hearing the remarkable speech of our distinguished ambassador, Gilad Erdan, I have almost nothing to add. He covered the whole idea, the philosophy behind it, and the great responsibility that you, young leaders, have to the future of this world. But I'll share with you some of my thoughts and some of my beliefs on which I based this project. In 2014, we established the Excellence Forum, the Excellence Social Forum, and the main idea and the main goal was to find those young people, those students who have basic leadership skills, train them, and prepare them for the future role. It's obvious to think that a young leader believes that he is a young leader, and if he doesn't know it at the beginning of his life, and if he doesn't get the needed, let's say, information, training, he probably won't be there. Before I started this project, I visited 95 different high schools and universities and in Israel. And when I asked those young people, what do they think about carrying this burden of being a social leader, being a leader? Most of them didn't even think about it. And the reasons are very well known, self-interest and so on. But when they went through a process, a very short process, at the beginning, their approach to this liability of being a leader and changing society changed. So we created a 3-year program, and in that program, they go over a lot of workshops, but the main thing is meeting the most, let's say, the most influencer leaders. And if we look at this room today, we will find here the Vice President of the Supreme Court of Israel, the Vice President of the European Court of Human Rights, the former President of the International Criminal Court. We will have with us this evening Professor Alon Chen, which is the President of the Weizmann Institute of Science, and Dr. David Deutsch, and Dr. Ute Hoffmann, who represent the German government. All these people, and some others that are here with us tonight, all of them, each one of them, left a mark, if not on his own society, so in the whole world. And the way to train young leaders is always by bringing these role models and being able to have a dialogue with them and see their legacy and see how did they become leaders. So this is the main part of the program. The other parts are, of course, workshops and learning and training and learning how to research a case and so on. But the moot court that we're going to present in a few minutes is only one of the methods we are using in order to instill values of human rights among young leaders and through them to the rest of the world. This is one example. I chose the defendant Ernst Rudin after a long research and I spent a lot of my time in Germany investigating the killing centers of the kids, the killing centers of the adults, speaking with the professor that researched the case. And first of all, for me, it was a big surprise. I knew nothing about Ernst Rudin and the euthanasia in Germany. I confess, I never heard about it before. But what was much more interesting and astonishing is that Ernst Rudin had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. He even wasn't racist by the ordinary meaning of that expression. He was a scientist. He believed that he's going to create a better world by killing those sick people. But what happened is that this kind of racism changed his path, and when the discussions about the final solution started, they found out that Ernst Rudin had a beautiful program called T4. He was the man behind that program, and he already had a lot of experience how to kill people easily by gas chambers and crematoriums. So what happened is that this guy that had nothing to do with Jews found himself, the whole system of T4, they found themselves in the land of Poland, preparing the gas chambers and the concentration camps and so on. The end was 3 million people, mostly Jews, killed by the system that Ernst Rudin, the big professor, psychiatrist, thought. So this case is just an example. Today, we are not having only Ernst Rudin on trial. We have with him a large number of doctors, leaders, and people who had influential positions, and they used it for incitement. At that time, it was anti-Semitism. In other time, there were a lot of different reasons why to kill others. So the young leaders in this program and the young litigators tonight are representing the main idea that we should treat young people and young leaders in a different way. We should find them, we should prepare them for the future role, and we have a very interesting program for that, which is very simple to implement. And it's a good occasion when we have here representatives of the UN, because what I said yesterday in a meeting that we had about anti-Semitism and fighting racism and protecting human rights, what I said is that the next step of this program is going to be the International Young Leaders Parliament for Human Rights, okay? And by the next year, we hope to have not only 10 countries, but 20 working with us according to the Israeli model, which already has showed a very great success in Israel after 5 years of pilot. So we think that this institute, the United Nations, which brought to the world the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that according to my point of view should be a super constitution that binds every country to watch and to keep at least the minimum that is in this Universal Declaration. So I think that the right place, the right umbrella of this International Young Leaders Parliament should be this institution. And representatives of all the participating countries that will take part in this international parliament should be here once a year think about the programs, present the new international mock trial, and each year it will be a different subject. And I think that the best place and the best umbrella should be this place, this institution. And of course, we'll have enough time to speak about it. And one word to these young litigators here. Most of these young litigators have been working through more than a year on this project, because we didn't bring them here just to say a few words or present an argument. We brought them here after they researched, learned, and discussed the whole wide subject of human rights. And then, only in the last paragraph, Ernst Rudin. And for that mission, we created in the last 5 years the Young Leaders Academy, which has already more than 100 lecturers, professors, judges, and distinguished people from all over the world. This Young Leaders Academy is like a small college or university, a virtual one, and these people are ready at any moment to be in our side and to help us train future young leaders. So I wish you good luck now in your presentation, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Omer.
1 second. Sharian. So I just came here to say thank you to everybody. I'm Avi Omer partner, Sefi Fischler. So I would like to thank our distinguished guests. Thank you, Melissa Fleming, Undersecretary General for Global Communications. Thank you, Ambassador Gilad Erdan, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations. Thank you, Maria Vasileva-Blazev, Special Advisor in the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And thank you, Avi, of course. And you may take your seats. Thank you. The young litigators will now come forward.
I just forgot one anecdote that I want to share with you. If I know something, it's because I had a very talented teacher. His name was Avinoam Erdan. His name is. Avinoam Erdan was my teacher. And Gilad is his son. So you see the connection between us. And I think that me and Gilad had a very good teacher, Avinoam, which is not here. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are very proud to present the International Mock Trial on Human Rights.
The judicial tribunal presiding over this case includes judges who came from all over the world for this trial, in the common task of helping to instill values of human rights in young leaders around the world. Our panel includes senior judges from the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and the Supreme Court of Israel. Before I invite the honorable judges, I will ask that upon saying, "All rise," all in the audience here tonight who are able to will stand to their feet. We ask that you maintain complete silence during trial. All of those who are able, rise. You may sit down.
Court for Human Rights, case number 001, 2022, Prosecutor Humanity, Defendant Professor Ernst Rudin, dual citizen of Switzerland and Germany. The defendant, in a career of 4 decades before Hitler came to power, and in his many central roles as the highest scientific authority in the field of psychiatry under the Nazi regime, is charged with conceiving, promoting, and applying racial hygiene theories which brought about the sterilization and murder of hundreds of thousands of psychiatric patients and people with disabilities through the forced sterilization law and the so-called euthanasia program. This paved the way to the mass murder of millions of Jews and hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti, along with other peoples considered by the Nazis to be undesirable in the Nazi death camps. For the purpose of this trial, the Honorable Court is asked to issue a declarative judgment whether the defendant bears direct or indirect responsibility as per the legal definitions of a non-military commander or what is known as co-perpetrator to the following acts or omissions. First, incitement to crimes against humanity of murder, extermination, torture, and persecution in accordance with Articles 7.1a, 7.1b, 7.1f, 7.1g, and 7.1h to the Statute of Rome, as well as Article 6c from 1945. Incitement to genocide in accordance with Article 6 of the Statute of Rome, as well as Articles 3c to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948. Incitement, as well as directly causing the crime of humanity of sterilization in accordance with Article 7.1g to the Statute of Rome, as well as Article 7.17.1. Membership in criminal organization as per Articles 9 and 10 to the Nuremberg Principle. May the prosecution give its opening speech.
Luckily, this is just temporary. So I am sure the defendant will excuse me. Honorable judges, the National Socialist regime defined itself as applied biology, a partnership between science and politics aiming to get the German people to a new level of evolution. The goal of the Nazis was to improve the so-called racial hygiene of the German people by promoting, in the terms of the eugenics movement, the breeding of citizens with desirable traits, high intelligence, morality, courage, while preventing the breeding of those with undesirable traits, low intelligence, criminality, mental illness, all considered hereditary at the time. The government became the doctor. The people, as a collective, were the patient, and the undesirables, threatening to multiply out of control in the nation's body, were the disease. almost immediately after assuming power in 1933, the Nazi government took the first step towards what it called national healing, with the passing of the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Progeny, also called the Forced Sterilization Law. The Nazi government initiated a nationwide propaganda campaign to indoctrinate the German people to accept the law. It portrayed people with disabilities as biological enemies of the nation and the financial burden on the state with the full force of scientific authority. The prosecution presents evidence items 1 to 6. Slide.
What a court.
$60,000 marks a year. The cost on the disabled on the expense of healthy population. Slide. Sterilization is not punishment, but liberation. Slide. The healthy are paying the price of support of the disabled. Slide. What will be the result if the unfit will bear 4 children while the fit will bear only 2 children? Slide. The valueless are multiplying too fast. Slide. The disabled are the cause of the degeneration of the German race. The Nazi government established a system of 200 sterilization courts around the country. Each court had a judge and 2 doctors. More than 400,000 people were sterilized against their will. 5,000 died as a result of complications in the procedure.
But this was only the beginning. The Nazi propaganda on the unfit relayed the most sinister message, purporting that the men, women, and children they deemed incurable should be killed for their own good, to shorten their alleged suffering. The propaganda claimed that had these people been able to speak for themselves, they would have asked for death anyways. The Nazi propaganda used the word euthanasia, which means mercy killing, to disguise their true intent. The cold-blooded and calculated murder of men, women, and children considered by the Nazis as worthless, meaning life not worth living. It is important not to be fooled by the Nazis' lies, nor to confuse their use of the word of euthanasia, what the word means today, and how it is used today. Today, a patient may, in some countries, choose an assisted death, and only be granted to do so if they are suffering immensely from terminal illness. In Nazi Germany, the psychiatrists who believe in so-called racial hygiene decided who would be killed, and they justified their murder as a way to improve the nation, as a way to avoid what they argued was a financial burden, and as a way to save the nation from the presence of ill genes. Thus, by the mid of the 1930s, medical practitioners were leaving psychiatric inmates to starve. And in 1937, the Nazi regime recruited the first team of medical experts and doctors to plan and design a so-called mercy-killing euthanasia program. First, 31 children wards for what they said were special treatment were established in psychiatric centers around the country, equipped with gas chambers to kill babies and children they diagnosed were feeble-minded or born with physical defects. the secret and so-called mercy killing program quickly expanded to include adult patients. With Hitler's formal blessing, 6 psychiatric centers were established around the country, equipped with gas chambers as the new method of murder and crematoria to dispose of the bodies. The killing program was called the T4 program, located after the address of its main locations in Tiergartenstraße 4 in Berlin. The prosecution presents a map of the killing centers and a photo of the headquarters of the T4 killing program masked as euthanasia. Evidence items A and B. Slide. The staff, doctors, and nurses in the killing center started using poison gas to kill people under their care of January 1940, more than a year and a half before the mass killing of Jews in death camps. The doctors and nurses gassed more than 70,000 patients to death in the T4 program.
Honorable judges, the scandalous program was executed secretly. With that, each time those doctors and nurses intentionally homicide those innocent patient lives, they will come out deliberately and vehemently falsifying the actual truth or the cardinal causes that led to the death of those innocent lives. However, the truth didn't last long. When the truth was revealed, flabbergastingly or surprisingly, when the truth was revealed to the public, with no hesitation or immediately, the resulting public uproar to pressurize Hitler to give an immediate order to put an end to the T4 by August 1941. Honorable judges, despite or regardless of those killing centers being dismantled or annihilated from a spot, the killing rate didn't decrease, nor it stopped, but rather it is escalated or skyrocketed. Moreover, it expanded by virtually all psychiatric hospitals are embedded within the nation, where doctors and nurses intentionally homicide or murder 230,000 additional patients through starvation, poisoning, and electroshocks. Honorable judges, the prosecution would love to reveal an evidence, which is a short video from Bamberg Memorial Center, located near Berlin, where one of those killing centers was situated, and facilities were kept intact or undamaged. We want to thank the head of the museum, Dr. Hoffner. We can proceed with the video.
This building is located on the site of a psychiatric hospital opened in 1875 in Bernburg, a small town about 200 kilometers southwest of Berlin. In the years 1940 to 1941, this very building was one of the central facilities where mentally handicapped, mentally ill, elderly, and socially conspicuous people were murdered. Today, a memorial keeps alive the memory of the victims here. In Bernburg, the central rooms and part of the technical facilities have been preserved. The following tour will give an insight into the organization of the mass murder of sick, disabled, and old people. A well-organized logistics system brought men, women, and children from a total of 40 sanatoriums and nursing homes to Bernburg from Monday to Friday. The transports were carried out by buses that entered a large garage. From there, the patients had to enter the building in small groups and undress. Administrative staff checked the transport lists, and the doctor selected the most plausible cause of death. Nursing staff took people to the basement and there to the gas chamber. Then gas flowed in for a few minutes, and after about an hour the gas chamber was vented. The corpse burners rinsed the bodies and dragged them towards the crematorium. All the bodies were burned one by one. Their relatives received letters with false information about the death of their family members. The actual events were not to become known.
Stop.
Another part received a
Honorable judges, the staff of the killing centers were so efficient, they were promoted. You can tenderly continue, please.
This building is located on the site of a psych. This building is located on the site of a psychiatric hospital. This building is located.
I suggest you move on.
What?
I suggest you move on, please.
Can go?
No, please continue.
I'm done.
Honorable judges, this escalation of atrocities, this slippery slope, started from the field of medical science and was backed up by scientists at all levels, all through the way. And the highest scientific authority on the subject in Nazi Germany, indeed the most devout activist promoting it, was none other than the defendant, Professor Ernst Rudin. The prosecution will show how it was Rudin who provided the theory, lobbied for the legislation, organized the propaganda, trained the perpetrators, put his followers in key academic positions, and got the entire field of psychiatry to comply with maiming and killing their patients. Further, the prosecution will show Rudin's direct involvement in the crimes by formulating the sterilization law, sitting in judgment in sterilization courts, being heavily involved in the so-called euthanasia program itself, and even sending his own staff to experiment on victims before their killing. Finally, the prosecution will show how Rudin did not cooperate with the regime out of fear or intimidation, but quite the reverse. He viewed the new regime as a long-awaited opportunity to execute his version of a German people cleansed of all hereditary pathological elements. Honorable judges, the defendant was not a scientist in some ivory tower whose ideas were corrupted by an evil regime, as the defense would have you believe. Professor Rudin was an activist who stopped at nothing to convince the regime that he was the most fitting person to heal the nation, and through his position of power, brought about the most egregious crimes in modern history. We have here today a historical opportunity to find him guilty of his crimes.
Honorable judges, it is an injustice and an inappropriate act to find fault with a person 70 years after his death. Professor Ernst Rudin was one of the most well-known and respectable scientists of his time in the entire world. Fact, at the Museum of Natural History, not 3 miles from here, he was nominated as the head of the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations, replacing an American biologist, Charles B. Davenport. Even in 1939, on the brink of World War II, he was still invited to speak in international scientific conventions. His ambition was to improve humanity, and his tools were the scientific tools available at his times and the limited understanding of genetics which was available. Are we to judge him for this? Why then shall we not prosecute his colleagues in the West? And why stop there? Let's indict the medieval doctors for their bloodletting techniques and religious exorcists for their false cures to insanity. Despite all evidence the prosecution will show of the horrors which took place in mental institutions in Nazi Germany, the fact is the defendant, as a mere scientist, had zero administrative authority and zero command over what took place in the country. Let us not forget that any scientist should have the freedom to express his mind and opinion. While they can be seen as wrong today, the defendant thought and spoke them at a different time. exercising his right to voice his opinion as a scientist. Honorable judges, all through history, science and the search for truth have taken wrong turns and have still managed to self-correct it. This will continue, and progress will be made through a process of trial and error. Sometimes the wrong turn led to severe harms, but if this court will hold science accountable for taking wrong turns at times, we have to then indict a long line of scientists. From Albert Einstein, whose research contributed to the development of the atom bomb, to Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite. And that's a slippery slope if there ever was one.
The prosecution calls Elvira Manthi to the stage.
My name is Elvira Manthi. I was born Elvira Hempel in 1931 in Magdeburg, Germany. We were 15 children. We were very poor and were sent to my grandparents. But I fell ill, so my mother, she went to the youth welfare office to apply for support. But they didn't support us. On the contrary, there was a so-called Professor Dr. Fünfgeld. He examined me and claimed me mentally deficient. Thus, my little sister Lisa and me, we were sent to a children's asylum in Ochtspringe. I immediately noticed what was going on there. There were a lot of handicapped children, mentally handicapped children, and a lot of healthy children as well. One day before her 5th birthday, my sister Lisa was transported away. And 1 week later, it was my turn. There were only 8 children left. 8 children in all of the child's asylum. We were driven into a building. We were sitting in a bus, and I remember that bus. The windows were coated with paint so that we couldn't see through them. And we were driven into a building. And then we had to get out. And there were 3 women and 1 man. And then they yelled at us. Get undressed! Shoes there, clothes there, hurry! No. I thought to myself, Elvira, you will not get undressed. Something is wrong here. And I was hiding behind this very large man, and the other children had to get undressed. And then there was this woman who took child after child and opened the door to the gas chamber and shoved the child into the gas chamber. Of course, at that time, I didn't know it was a gas chamber. I just sensed the danger in there. All the children were gone. They were all in the chamber. Only me were still standing, fully dressed, hiding behind this Dr. Bunke. He was quite large, so I was overlooked. But then they saw me, and they yelled at me, "Get undressed or you get a beating!" Once I was naked, Dr. Bunke grabbed me by the left arm. "What's your name?" Elvira Hempel. How old are you? 8 years old. Get dressed again. Behind my name on the transport list, there was a question mark. I don't know why. Maybe because one day at the asylum, I picked up a broom and started cleaning the floor. Whenever there was any work at the asylum, I tried to make myself useful. On the 6th of October 1942, I was released after 7 years of hell. I saw many, many murders. I opened all the doors in the asylum, and I was able to see how the children were injected by the doctors and the nurses. I will never be able to forget that. I wasn't allowed to go to school. I didn't receive any education. I am a victim, and I have been dehumanized. And I want justice done today. Sorry. I'm sorry.
No further questions, Your Honor.
No questions, Your Honor.
Honourable Judges, the prosecution presents evidence item 7. Slide. A scanned document containing an article authored by the defendant entitled Alcohol in the Life of the Race. As the court can see, the defendant has preached for forced sterilisation since 1903, a full 30 years before the Nazi regime first rose to power. I quote from evidence item 7. To obtain biologically fit members of the race, it is necessary not only to have maximum propagation of those who are healthy, fit, robust, and ethically superior, but also to exclude the weak, ill, unfit, and morally reprehensible from reproduction by artificial selection, by instruction, and by private and government force. 2 years later, and still 28 years before the Nazi regime rose to power, the defendant co-founded the German Society for Racial Hygiene, an organization with the stated purpose of systematically applying the results of biological research to questions of social life and politics. Your Honors, this constitutes political activism to all intents and purposes. The defendant then continued his crusade in the following years. In 1916, still a full 17 years before propaganda against the disabled was first even circulated in German society, the defendant was already publicly promoting his statistical theory of the reproduction of the unfit within the German race. The prosecution would like to present evidence item 8, a diagram slide, illustrating the scientific methodology developed by the defendant in order to predict the development of hereditary disabilities and undesirable qualities within the German population.
Honorable judges, rather than being a pawn or intimidated tool in the hands of the Nazis, the defendant saw in the new regime the perfect partner to execute his plans. The prosecution presents as evidence item 9 a letter written by the defendant to the Nazi Minister of Interior less than 3 months after Hitler came to power, where he presents himself as the perfect candidate to promote Nazi racial hygiene, with the aim of integrating himself into the power structure of the new government. As he states himself, slide, I am the director of the German Research Institute for Psychiatry, which, as long as it has been in operation, has worked on the scientific genetic foundations that today's state, under Adolf Hitler's leadership, desperately needs. Furthermore, in a speech he gave in 1934, Rudin admitted that he found the perfect strategic partner in Adolf Hitler. The prosecution presents evidence item 10. Slide. The importance of race hygiene was recognized by the awakening Germans only through the political work of Adolf Hitler. And only thanks to him, our 30 years dream has finally become a reality, allowing race hygiene to translate into application. Finally, the prosecution presents evidence item 11, an article from the German Association of Psychiatry, where the defendant states clearly, and I quote, "The new German state needs to train psychiatrists and neurologists in racial hygiene, but also, conversely, the neurologists and psychiatrists who are racial hygienists need the National Socialist movement and the new state. Because without state leaders and without state organs and its leader, the efforts of the racial hygienist would have been doomed today."
Your Honors, my colleague mentioned a letter to the Ministry of Interior in which the defendant offered his services to the new government. The simple fact is that right after this letter was received, the defendant rose to the top professional leadership of the medical psychiatric community and to the position of the senior advisor to the Ministry of Interior on the subject of racial hygiene. Thus, in effect, he became the most powerful psychiatrist of all times. The prosecution presents evidence item 12, which shows the position of power held by the defendant until the end of World War II, most of them from the time National Socialism assumed power. Slide. As you can see, the defendant was the chief advisor to the government on racial hygiene and the head of the German Society for that field, as well as the editor of all professional magazines and head of the professional organizations of the relevant medical community, who in effect decided who would be positioned where and where finances will go as far as research. The defendant and the Nazi regime, they were a match made in heaven. The regime gained scientific validation and the defendant gained political access, financial support, and power positions, from which he was able to realize his vision to rid the nation of the unfit. The prosecution presents evidence item 13, a letter from 1939 written by the Nazi Minister of Health, Arthur Good, to Hitler himself. Slide. In it, Good writes, "There are probably few fields of research that are in a position to legitimize and further the goals of the National Socialist regime more than those pursued by Professor Dr. Ernst Rudin." And if this is still not enough, the prosecution presents evidence items 14 and 15, two distinguished medals the defendant received for his work at the service of the National Socialist regime. Slide. The first one, the Goethe Medal of Arts and Science, which the defendant received in 1939 from the Ministry of Interior. And the second one, the German Reichseagle Shield, which he received in 1944 from none other than Hitler himself, as a way of recognition for the pathfinder in the area of hereditary hygiene. These medals, given by the topmost murderer himself, and the many positions the defendant was trusted with by the Nazi regime, are proof enough of Rudin's seniority within the murderous mechanisms and his culpability for the crimes perpetrated.
Honorable judges, if this is not enough, the defendant was directly involved with the forced sterilization law and made its language as extreme as possible. As the top consultant to the Nazi government, he literally wrote the book on the forced sterilization law. The prosecution presents evidence item 16, a copy of the actual book with commentary. As the court can see, the defendant's name is right on top of its cover, next to an SS officer lawyer and none other than the Nazi Minister of Health, Arthur Gut himself. You recognize this, Mr. Rudin, don't you? The law stated that individuals could be sterilized against their free will if they met one of the 9 diagnoses. However, per the commentary, which included the defendant's prognosis, slide, people with disabilities are so dangerous that any suspicion was enough. Furthermore, right after the law passed in January 1934, the defendant hosted a special psychiatry course to 130 senior psychiatrists from all over the country, in which he encouraged them to implement the law into the most extreme manner possible. The prosecution presents evidence item 17, a quote from said lectures, which were later disseminated into one of the most important books for medical practitioners in Nazi Germany. And I quote, slide, "Psychiatrists who do not embrace the sterilization law with inner conviction should resign from their posts." As a proof to the extent of the defendant's contribution, 95.5% of the sterilized were diagnosed in psychiatry, his field of control.
Your Honors, in addition to his role in the legislative branch, in writing the law, and the fact he trained the doctors who administered it as part of the executive branch, the defendant was also at the top of the judicial branch as a judge in one of the country's highest appellate hereditary health courts, where individuals who were sentenced to sterilization on the lower court could appeal to the higher one. Your Honors, the prosecution submits evidence item 18, a letter from the defendant to his colleague from 1941, where he advises to influence the court towards a verdict of sterilization. And I quote, slide, "If you have a positive opinion on the one hand and a negative opinion on the other hand, then you should just cause the judges to follow the conclusions of your opinion." The prosecution notes that even if you were to deal only in his role as a judge, it is clear that the defendant ordered the execution of forced sterilization, or at least did not prevent them, in his authority as supreme arbiter for appeals.
The defense calls expert witness Dr. David Deutsch. Dr. Deutsch, please describe to the court your credentials.
My name is Dr. David Deutsch. I am a trained sociologist and anthropologist. I work as the head section at Yad Vashem for Asia and Africa relations. I am currently a lecturer at Haifa University and a researcher of euthanasia and eugenics.
Dr. Deutsch, was the defendant a member of the Nazi government or any branch thereof?
No, he was not. He carried no executive power in that aspect.
The prosecution mentioned the defendant was a senior advisor to the Nazi regime. Did he have any legislative or executive authority?
No, he did not. He had only advisory capacity at that point.
So who was the government authority deciding on the racial hygiene measures, such as the forced sterilization law?
There were two authorities combined. The Ministry of Interior, Wilhelm Frick, and the Ministry of Health, Arthur Gut. Those were the two people that were in charge of enacting the sterilization.
I understand. Could the defendant have prevented the law from being enacted?
No, he couldn't have.
A simple yes or no will suffice, Dr. Deutsch.
No, he could not.
Thank you. One of the assignments of the defendant and his team was to review the draft of the forced sterilization law and issue recommendations, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
How long did they have exactly to review it?
Well, I do not know how long they had, but they reviewed for about 1 day.
One day.
Yes.
Dr. Deutsch, the prosecution gave us an entire timeline of the defendant's career, long before Hitler, promoting racial hygiene from as early as 1903. Does that mean that the defendant was the founder of the German racial hygiene movement?
No, he was not. Usually, regarding the racial hygiene movement in Germany, people refer to Alfred Plötz and to the year 1895.
1895. How old was the defendant when it was founded?
He was about, I would say, 21 years old.
A medical student.
Yes, I would assume at the time would be a medical student, yes.
And how old was Hitler, just to match the prosecution's line of thought?
6 years old at the time.
Did racial hygiene ideology exist only in Germany?
No, absolutely not. Racial hygiene existed long before, I would say, mostly we refer to the UK as the beginning of that.
The UK?
Yes, 1883. And Francis Galton was one of the first leading scientists that advocated in favor of eugenics.
1883. How old was the defendant?
If, again, my math is correct, it would be 9.
Was the defendant the founder of eugenics?
No, he was not.
Your Honors, the defense presents evidence item 1. The founders of the racial hygiene movement and the eugenics movement. Slide. Alfred Plötz and Francis Galton. Thank you, Dr. Deutsch.
Thank you.
Dr. Deutsch, was Germany the only country in the world to enact a forced sterilization law to prevent bad stock from degenerating their populace?
Absolutely not. Sterilization laws were common in many countries at the time, long before Germany enacted its sterilization law.
Surely Germany was the first one to do so as an extreme and lunatic fringe on this subject on the international scene?
That is a common mistake, however, it is wrong. The leading entity in favor of eugenics, the first that began sterilization as a law, was actually the United States. Indeed, in the United States, the difference was that it was state-to-state basis, whereas in Germany, it was a federal law. However, to my understanding, what is called Buck versus Bell, which is when the Supreme Court of the US enabled the Sterilization Act to take place, to my understanding, till this day, was never overturned as a federal law.
All right, then how many states out of the 48 enacted such laws?
I would say before Hitler comes to power, you would have more than 30 states that enacted sterilization laws throughout the US.
30 states and some more that consider doing so.
Yes, yes, there were some in the progress those years.
Your Honors, the defense presents evidence item 2, showing a map of the states that enacted forced sterilization laws by the beginning of 1935. Slide, please. So, when was the first law on forced sterilization enacted in America?
In the United States, it was thought of already early on, in the early century, but the first enactment of that law was in 1907 in the state of Indiana.
So to borrow from the prosecution line of thinking, I believe this was 26 years before Hitler assumed power, right?
I would think that is correct.
So, Dr. Deutsch, how many men, women, and children were sterilized by force in the US because they were labeled as hereditarily defective?
The number people say, however, I would mention the fact that under Nixon, many were coerced to be sterilized, and I'm not mentioning those, however, they should be. But the number that agreed on as forced sterilization would be 64,000.
64,000. So after,
And this number is throughout the whole US.
So after World War II, forced sterilization continued in America and also after the Nuremberg trials.
Yes, then this number is from before the war, and it continues on far after 1945.
Until when?
Well, in Virginia, it was 78 or 79. In Oregon, 1981 was the last act of sterilization in Oregon.
Dr. Deutsch, what about other countries? How many people were sterilized by force in the name of eugenics? If you could, some example, please.
I give a few examples, but I do want to set the mindset. The mindset was that this is a legitimate act. The mindset was that it was appropriate by both sides of the political aisle, by feminist movements, by liberal movements. And that being said, I could say the numbers. There were about, in Japan, which was one of the biggest cases, with about 80,000. In Sweden, between 21 and 30,000. In Canada, about 3,000 people. And those are the ones that we know and that we could be accountable for saying their number. I assume there were many, many, many more. And these are just but a few examples.
Your honors, the defense presents as evidence item 3 a Nazi propaganda poster featuring flags of countries that already had forced sterilization laws when Nazi Germany passed its own. Slide. One can see flags of Japan, Canada, Australia, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and Iceland. Dr. Deutsch, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Deutsch, thank you for coming. Who were the people behind the American laws which led to the forced sterilization of 64,000 men, women, and children?
By the way, I would say so many people, which I can't mention, but many, many, all the system that enabled them to take place. However, I'll mention only two. Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin. Those two were the most influential ones.
Your honors, the defense presents evidence item number 4, pictures of Davenport and Laughlin. Slide. Davenport and Laughlin were the head and founders of the American Eugenics Record Office, the birthplace of the eugenic legislation in the United States. The American Eugenics Record Office was located at Cold Spring Harbor, about an hour's drive due northeast from where we are right now. And these activist scientists, slide, who promoted the sterilization laws were eventually indicted for their heinous actions, of course.
No, they were not. They were not. They were never indicted. Most eugenicists, even those that participated in sterilizations, were never indicted.
Dr. Deutsch, is it possible that the Nazi sterilization law was inspired or influenced by the American sterilization law in any way?
It's more than possible. It's more than plausible. It's quite obvious. It was based on the eugenic model law, and that the legislation in Virginia, when you compare it to the Nazi legislation, which was done 10 years later, you see both the categories, the language. You see that they more or less took that as a model, and upon that model, they based the German sterilization law.
I understand. The defense presents evidence item number 5. Slide. An American poster. Dr. Deutsch, less than an hour's walk from here stands the American Museum for Natural History. It played quite a part in the history of international eugenics movement, did it not?
Yes, it did.
Dr. Deutsch, who was the president of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations in those years?
Well, I want to just say they held the second and third conferences here. It was in 1921 and in 1932. They had two conferences, and it's interesting because the first president of that movement was Charles Davenport, the one you just saw. And the third one that replaced him was actually the defendant sitting there, Ernst Rudin.
So the defendant became the head of the international umbrella organization for all eugenic organizations in the world after an American scientist, and was elected for this position right here, less than 2 miles from where we are right now?
Yes, that is correct.
Were there any other leading names part of these congresses?
Well, there were so many. There's so many leading names. I'll give you a few. Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles, Alexander Graham Bell, and many, sadly, many, many others.
I understand. Thank you, Dr. Deutsch. Dr. Deutsch, you may now step down.
Thank you.
Honorable judges, I wish to submit as evidence item 6 a letter which was written in 1913 to Charles Davenport, who, as we just heard, was the president of the International Federation of Eugenic Organization just before the defendant. And I quote, slide. Societies has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind. It is extraordinary that our people refuse to apply to human beings such as elementary knowledge that every successful farmer is obliged to apply to his own stock breeding. One day, we will realize that the prime duty, the inescapable duty of the citizens of the right type is to leave his or her blood behind is in the world, and that we have no business to permit the perpetuation of the citizens of the wrong type. Signed, slide please, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States. The defendant rests, Your Honor.
Next. Setz dich.
Ja.
Your hometown.
Berlin?
In which district?
I don't know.
What kind of government do we have today?
National Socialist.
Who discovered America?
Columbus.
How many days are in the week?
7.
What are the names of the days, and name them beginning from end?
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday,
Schneller.
Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Good. Now name them from end to beginning. Go.
Sunday, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday.
Good. Good. How many months a year?
12.
Name them and list them from beginning to end. Go, schneller.
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, August.
Ja, gut. Jetzt von hinten nach vorne. Los. Schneller, name them. Go.
December, November, October, September, August, July, August.
Gut. Wir sind fertig, du kannst gehen. Nein, nicht diese Tür. You go this door.
Honorable judges, 400,000 women, children, and men were all sterilized against their will in Germany in less than a decade. More than 5 times the number in the rest of the world in half a century combined. Additionally, racial hygiene in Nazi Germany went much further than forced sterilization, the so-called euthanasia program. And this extra step which eventually also contributed to the Holocaust, was only possible thanks to effective and systematic indoctrination of the German people, the product of the defendant's incitement. The prosecution presents evidence item 19, a speech the defendant gave in 1934 to the German society, right after he became its head, thanks to his alliance with the new government, and I quote, slide. The society values most the harmonic cooperation with others, like the Ministry of Propaganda, the National Socialistic Teachers Federation, the National Socialistic Doctors Association, and the National Socialistic Teachers Association of the German culture. Slide. Men of science, the arts, and all practices from all layers of the nation and all professions should learn to view all German topics through race hygiene. Slide. The society should, with all its powers, support the state as it issues rules related and based on hygiene, and help carrying out these rules in a desirable, enthusiastic atmosphere. And what were the means to create such an enthusiastic atmosphere? Slide. Lectures, courses, information, as well as the systematic service of the press, in particular, the local press read by the masses daily. And from September that same year marked evidence item 20, slide. Systematic daily enlightenment in school from the beginning, exactly like the ABC. Your Honor, you get the point. The defendant coordinated the brainwashing of the German nation on all its parts in collaboration with all relevant government entities. This was not scientific discourse, nor was it theoretical. These speeches were belligerent and given with criminal intent in his relentless claim that the German society was affected by the mentally and disabled people. He, in effect, sentenced them to death.
Your Honors, with all due respect, when did the prosecution prove incitement? As was already established, the defendant had no role or authority in the Nazi propaganda office or any other part of the administration. His big plans prove nothing as far as execution or actual involvement is concerned. Even more to the point, there is not a single citation of the defendant advocating patient killing. The truth is, there is no causality between the defendant and the program itself. Rudin's publications were merely scientific and constituted a debate among scientists. The defense restates its heartfelt message. Any claim that the publication of scientific studies constitutes criminal incitement will, inevitably, result in the paralysis of science and human progress. Will a scientist who warns of the dangers of an epidemic be prosecuted for nothing, for inciting against the infected public?
Honorable judges, let us review precedent of incitement in international criminal law. At the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda of the murder of 1 million people, the judges determined that the incitement by the defendants was equivalent to, quote, slide, spreading petrol throughout the entire country, little by little, so that one day the defendants would be able to set fire to the whole country, unquote. The court ruled that encouraging resentment in a murderous environment, which is likely to result in violence, is an indication of intent to incite genocide. But there's an even more relevant precedent to the case before us. In the trial of the major war criminals in Nuremberg, one of the defendants was Nazi propagandist Julius Streicher, owner of the newspaper Der Stürmer, or The Attacker in English. The prosecution presents evidence item 21, Julius Streicher and a sample of Der Stürmer. Slide. Streicher was convicted and sentenced to death for his involvement in Nazi propaganda, although he did not hold any administrative position in the killing mechanism, nor did he harm anyone directly. The court viewed him as a source of incitement and as a catalyst of the criminal acts of the Nazi regime by creating a hostile atmosphere and misleading public opinion. The crimes he was convicted for included the crime of murder, the crime of persecution, and the crime of extermination as defined in Section 6C of the Nuremberg Charter. And for these acts, he was sentenced to death. The combination of these crimes and the circumstances of the Stryker trial today constitute the crime of incitement to genocide under modern international criminal law, and the defendant must be found guilty on this count.
Your Honors, the court in Nuremberg determined Stryker's guilt, even though he withdrew from political involvement and limited himself to the publication of his newspaper more than 2 years before the final solution. The rationale for his conviction was the hatred which he broadcasted for decades, which infected the German nation with the virus of anti-Semitism, and the fact that he continued to incite against the Jews after knowing of the extermination in the East. Ernst Rudin incited and infected the medical community with the virus of racial hygiene for decades, long before the Nazis' rise to power, and continued to incite hatred against the disabled people, parallel to the forced sterilization law and the so-called euthanasia program, both of which he was well aware. But there is one more very important precedent to consider here between Stryker and the case before us. Stryker's propaganda against the Jews used imagery of pathological diseases, germs, parasites, spreaders of disease whose extermination served the good of all mankind. In other words, Stryker used medical imagery to define his intended victims as diseases in the body of the nation. Even Stryker, the crude bully, backed his incitement by medical, scientific authority. Now compare Stryker's authority on the subject to the authority of the co-founder of racial hygiene and the leader of the International Federation on the subject, and you see the prosecution's point. By his authority as a scientist, while using the same powerful medical concepts Stryker used and was convicted for, the defendant rises above and beyond a common propagandist like Stryker or those convicted in Rwanda, and based on this precedent, should be found guilty of massive, direct incitement to the commission of genocide.
Your Honors, the defense presents evidence item number 7. Hitler's letter written in October of 1939, but backdated by him to the 1st of September of the same year in order to fit the beginning of the war. Slide. And I quote, Berlin, September 1st, 1939. Reichsleiter Philipp Buller and Dr. Matt Brandt are charged with the responsibility to broaden the authority of certain doctors to the extent that people suffering from certain illnesses judged to be incurable may, after a humane, most careful assessment of their conditions, be granted a mercy death. Signed, Adolf Hitler. Following the above letter, a Reichscommittee was convened to handle the execution of the so-called euthanasia program. It included many colleagues of the defendant and was directly below Hitler's personal chancellery. The defense now presents evidence item number 8, the chain of command and execution of the killing program under Hitler. Slide. The defense notes the absence of the defendant in the graphic, and hence in the chain of command. Additionally, the defense presents evidence item number 9, correspondence amongst the main psychiatrists in the killing program about an euthanasia law which they tried to get Hitler to approve as to protect themselves legally. Slide. As the court can see, it bears many names and signatures, except the defendant's. He was simply not involved, again. With all the acrobatics, the fact remains. The defendant did not hold any position in any part of the mechanisms of managing, planning, or execution of the so-called euthanasia program.
Your Honor. Your Honor, the defense argues that the so-called euthanasia program was carried out as a direct and exclusive result of Hitler's order and chain of command in his private chancellery. Well, answer me this. How does the defense explain the fact that the killing of patients by psychiatrists began spontaneously years before any order from Nazi leadership and without any legal protection or permission from the authorities? The prosecution presents evidence item 22, A quote from Professor Volker Roch, one of the most prominent expert historians on the subject. And I quote, slide. Recent historical research has shown that the initiatives for the patient killing, euthanasia, came not from the political arena, but directly from the physicians involved. If so-called euthanasia only took place as a result of Hitler's orders, how does the defense explain the fact that even after Hitler ordered a stop to the program in August 1941, following widespread public outcry, not only did the killing not stop, but it expanded into virtually all mental facilities across the country and to its deadliest phase? Furthermore, how does the defense explain the fact that in some institutions, the killing of patients continued even after the war was over, stopping only when Allied forces entered the facilities and put a stop to the horrors themselves? Honorable judges, the patient murder started independently, continued independently following Hitler's stop order, and persisted for weeks, even after Allied flags flew over German cities. And it was all done by the exact target audience for the incitement of the defendant. As a result of the authoritative and scientific legitimacy he gave to the program, he gave to the attack against the worthless, the unfit, the burden on the race.
Your Honors, without taking from any of our earlier arguments, the defense would just want to note that the prosecution mixed the 1945 Nuremberg Charter, which was used on the International Nuremberg Tribunal, with modern-day international law, is defined in the 1998 Rome Convention and is used in the International Criminal Court. The only actionable crime of incitement is incitement to genocide. And the definition of genocide, as in Article 6 of the Rome Statute, includes only 4 types of groups: national, ethnic, racial, or religious. The defendant never incited to commit any action against any of these 4 groups. In fact, the defendant never discussed any group at all, only scientific psychiatric diagnosis. Therefore, the entire discussion is void.
Your Honors, in that case, the prosecution asks the court to create a precedent to include people with disabilities as a 5th type of group a genocide can be perpetrated against. Furthermore, the prosecution would like to present additional evidence of the defendant's involvement in the killing program. The following slide, presented as evidence item number 23, shows the executives in the Society of German Neurologists and Psychiatrists. Slide. We remind the court that the defendant, as founder and chairman, was the only one who decided who would be promoted to the top positions in this organization. The prosecution presents the same chart, with red markings designating who of these executives participated directly in the killing program. Slide. One of the charges against the defendant is membership in a criminal organization, not the SS, not the Nazi Party. The criminal organization that we are talking about is the Society of German Neurologists and Psychiatrists itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
The court is referred to the only name in the chart, which is not red, but yellow. This is Dr. Hans Römer, who opposed the patient killing from its beginning, and after failing to prevent it, retired as to not be a part of it. The prosecution presents evidence item 24, a letter the defendant submitted to the health ministry in which he outlines to his colleague, Dr. Hans Römer, his opinions. Of outstanding importance for racial justice, due to its significance, Sorry. The prosecution presents evidence item 24, a letter from the defendant to his colleague, Paul Nietzsche, his closest colleague and associate, who was the director of the killing program at the time, and I quote, "With Mr. Rumor I have not spoken, nor did I write to him since Berlin. I've only given him, still in Berlin, the simple, personal written and short advice not to take any more upon himself, for his own interest. As the Honorable Court can see, the defendant warned his own subordinate, the only one who went against the murder, to keep quiet, for his own good. As a note, this letter is from January 1940. This proves the defendant knew about the killing from its beginning. The prosecution presents evidence item 25, a letter from the defendant to the Health Ministry, which he wrote in 1942, which has 17 points in it. The prosecution would like to quote point number 10. Of outstanding importance for racial justice, due to its significance as the foundation for a humane and secure response against counter-selective processes of every kind in the body of our German nation, would be the exploration of the question to which children, infants and toddlers, can even as early childhood be proven as genetically and clinically inferior and thus worthy of elimination. With complete conviction and evidentiary power so irreproachably that both in their own interest and in the interest of the German nation, they can be recommended for euthanasia. As the court can see, the defendant pushed for more research to find even more evidence of so-called feeble-minded kids, so that their parents could be convinced with full scientific authority that it is justified to kill them. Not only that, and as my honorable colleague will show, the defendant even financed the research himself.
Honorable judges, one of the defendant's favorite protégés was Dr. Julius Dusan. Dr. Dusan conducted tests on children for the exact purpose the defendant spoke about in his plan, to physically prove their hereditary physical inferiority. As we know today, at least 21 children were tested and interviewed by him and then sent to be killed in a special children killing center so he could dissect their brains to try to find the biological cause of their feeble-mindedness. The prosecution presents evidence item 26, a recommendation letter the defendant wrote in 1945 to his employee psychiatrist, Julius Dusan. Slide. And I quote, "For over a year, Dusan continues to conduct in full scope his research, by whose work I expect, among other things, significant information on the origin of idiocy. For this reason, I have continued to provide him with a budget for his expenses."
Honorable judges, this is Professor Hermann Pfannmuller. Slide. The director of the psychiatric institution in the town of Egelfinghar, not far from the defendant's institute in Munich. His mental hospital operated as a euthanasia center for children, as a concentration point for patients on their way to the regional T4 gassing center, and from 1941 as a killing center in its own right. Pfannmuller also functioned as one of the program's so-called medical experts and reviewed forms to determine if patients should live or die. He did hundreds of them in his spare time after a day's work in the hospital. Based on actual calculations, which was done during the Nuremberg doctor's trial, the average time he gave to each form was 5 minutes. The prosecution presents evidence item 27, the annual report of the Defendant's Research Institute for the years 1939 to 1940, the very beginning of the so-called euthanasia program. In this report, slide, the defendant proudly announces a rise in the number of brain autopsies from previous years, thanks to the opening of an extension of his institute in Professor Herman van Muller's psychiatric asylum in Egelfing-Haar. The defendant thanks Van Muller by name and then thanks another person, Walter Schultz, the local representative of the TFAR program. Honorable judges, the prosecution will now present the last of its witnesses, the person who actually discovered less than 10 years ago the remaining brains left of the defendant's horrendous experiments in his institute in Munich.
Your Honors. Professor Hien, can you introduce yourself and your current title?
My name is Alon Chen. I'm a neuroscientist, a professor for neuroscience. And since December 2019, I'm also serving as the president of the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel.
What was your previous position and in which years?
From August 2013 till December 2019, I served as the director at the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry in Munich, Germany.
So you actually had the same position and the same institute as the defendant?
Indeed, at that time it was called the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, but the defendant, Ernst Rudin, actually was holding the same or similar position as the director of the institute at that time.
Sir, what was your part in exposing the role of the institute in relation to the defendant and the euthanasia program?
When I joined the institute in August 2013, I received information that all human remains, mainly brain tissues, collected during the war were collected and buried in the early 90s. Nevertheless, during the first year, I received, or it came to my attention that unfortunately there are still brain tissue kept in the archive of the Institute, and following internal investigation, we indeed found additional tissue, which was large amount of brain tissues. This was not known to the leadership of the Max Planck Society, the Generalverwaltung, the managing leadership of the society, and they were surprised, as I was extremely surprised with these findings.
Thank you, Professor Hien. Thank you, your judges.
Honorable judges. Let's review what we have seen here. We learned all the defendant's colleagues were directly involved in the killing program, but not him. And we learned that he warned one of his colleagues who publicly opposed the killing to be careful for his own good. A logical warning when taken into account the regime's treatment with oppositions. And we learned, as a scientist, he tried to get scientific proof for the biological origin of mental deficiency so as to avoid wrong labeling based on subjective opinions or tests, a quest a medical field is still working on today. And we learned that the dissection department in the Institute of the Defendants cooperated with another mental hospital which was involved in the killing, but without even a shred of evidence that there was any cause-effect relationship with any killing that might have been there.
Finally, from the broad statement of the prosecution about command responsibility and direct involvement in the killing of 300,000 patients, we get an indirect, trial-removed connection to a different researcher than the defendant, who tested 21 children on the way to death as part of a government killing program. And all these come to compensate for the simple fact that the defendant had no part in the so-called euthanasia program, which was administered in Berlin on the other side of Germany from his institute in Munich, and by Hitler's chancellery and the Special Reichskammer in which he was not a member.
Professor, you want to go?
Professor Rudin, I'm so glad to see you.
Oh, the professor is very busy with his reports right now. Please, can you look into the evaluations? Just this morning, only 525. At this rate, we will never create a significant change.
Yes, Arnold, that is true, but I actually came for a different problem. And Professor, I'm a veteran evaluator, and I'm doing my job really well.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Ola, I do understand.
I am a very dedicated member of your staff, and I have the highest number of evaluations and sterilizations. And I'm doing my job really well, but Professor, something happened. They just told me I need to undergo sterilization. Professor.
This is all I can do for you, Ola.
Ola,
You don't do it
no,
for yourself.
Listen to me. I grew up practically on your lab. And my father was an alcoholic. This is true, but I never drank a drop in my life. And they told me I need to undergo sterilization.
I cannot
This
help
is
you.
insane.
I cannot help you.
Professor,
I commend you to leave.
I just got dizzy doing the evaluations, reading the questionnaire because of all the stress, you know? And I
Ola.
just need 1 second.
Ola, Arnold,
Ola, come on.
you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this for humanity.
I know. But this is, Professor, this is a mistake. Just evaluate me yourself. Professor, this cannot be! I'm not due for sterilization! Arnold, let me go! Professor, please! You know me since I'm a little child! Let me go!
Honorable judges, in closing, the evidence clearly shows that the defendant, Mr. Ernst Rudin, incited against people with disabilities for 3 decades before Hitler and used the first opportunity he got in the new regime to realize his vision. Rudin was the one who set the tone of the entire psychiatric field, the professional group which had committed the crimes. He was the chief advisor and head of the team which conceived all policy recommendations for education and propaganda on racial hygiene. He was the legislator, the judge, and the trainer of executioners on the sterilization of close to 500,000 people. He continued to support the second murderous phase with all his might as the top scientist in that field. And his support of the murder was much more than theoretical, with attempts to scientifically justify the killings, actions to silence the opposition, support of experimentation involving the killing itself, and brain research making use of its victims. The defense argued that one must view Rudin's actions in the context of his period, when his convictions were commonly held. Well, it is time to draw a line on this relativism. If one can argue that eugenics was just a fad of 80 years ago, before we progressed and matured to who we are now, then one can mention that the Hippocratic Oath was written 2,500 years ago, and human rights and dignity are ideas as old as Cyrus the Great. The Declaration on Human Rights is universal for a reason. These are universal values. They apply to everyone, always, and that's the point. They are not relative, and we must never forget that.
Your Honors, in 1949, that's just 4 years after the World War and 3 years after the Nuremberg medical trials, the Nobel Prize was granted to Portuguese scientist Antonio Egas Moniz. The reason? His development of an innovative and revolutionary treatment for insanity. That treatment was the lobotomy, the insertion of an ice pick into the eye of the patient, severing the delicate connections between their frontal brain lobes. Almost 100,000 patients were treated with the lobotomy, in effect turning them into human vegetables, before the practice was banned for being inhumane. What do you think humanity in 80 years would say about some of our medical practices today? Regrettably, there's no real way of knowing. I'll give you another datum. Up to World War II, Germany was the only country to have a medical ethical code. And when the Nazi doctors were questioned on how they could justify their actions based on this medical code, they answered that it was because of this code that they did what they did. Because in their eyes, it made them responsible for the greatest good for the nation's body. The prosecution speaks on universal values, which is fair. But there's another value, which is universal and speaks for all in its most basic of meanings. And that is the value of justice. And that should apply to all. Professor Rudin acted in the same exact way as his American counterparts, based in the same exact beliefs held by the US President Theodore Roosevelt, the US Federal Supreme Court Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, Charles Darwin, H.G. Wells, Alexander Graham Bell, George Bernard Shaw, and so many others, including even Winston Churchill. The only difference between him and his counterparts in the West, who, might I add, were as energetic, if not even more, in their lobbying actions to sterilize the disabled, was that he lived in a country with a centralized totalitarian government. That's all. If it were up to Laughlin or Davenport, America would have done the same. Same goes for England and the rest of Europe. So, you want to change that? You want to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Make sure that the autonomy of individuals will never be violated by utopian-crazed governments again. But don't presume to know what is right in science, at least until you can look at it from the rearview mirror of 80 years. Thank you.
How dare you? Indeed, you are destroying the future of humanity with your own hands. With your self righteousness, protecting the weak, and perpetuating generations of human beings wretched? Who gave you the authority? Who gave you the authority to interfere with the ways of nature? Evolution teaches us that only the strong and the smart survive. That is the only way for humanity to better itself, to improve, to advance, to upgrade, if you like, if you may. Look around you. Look at the handicapped, the mentally ill, the schizophrenic, the epileptic. Look at their suffering, their misery, their life with no reason to live. What is the use of all this suffering? Why suffering? Why suffering in this world? Can't we reduce it a little bit? Through our genetic research, we gave humanity the hope for the creation of the continuously improving happiness, healthy human beings, of harmonious efficient humanity. We wanted to liberate the misfortunate and prevent the birth of generation after generation of misery. If I stand here today as a visionary scientist to be convicted for my achievements, then you should also put on trial for the same reasons Galileo, Albert Einstein. Have you lost your minds? I am deeply appalled, not for my own sake, but in the name of science. How dare you? It's not me who catalog people, pretend to know what is normal and what is not normal. It's you. It's you who do that. Claiming to be the enlightened one, while accepting, understanding the others, accepting them, respect their diversity. While labeling every slight diversion in this world among humans a pretended norm that can be challenged, that can be cured. You can't deny it. You do it through your medical manuals, media, teachers, parents, so-called experts. To hell with this hypocrisy. I am Professor Ernst Rudin, and I declare myself the victim of the enlightened humanity. Yes, victim. Honorable judges, if one can't have honorable life, that one should have at least die honorably, or prevent his life on set as debt to your universal declaration. That were my words.
The honorable judges will now discuss the evidence presented before them. All those who are able, rise. You may sit down. The honorable judges will now return to give their verdict. All those who are able, please rise once more. You may sit down. The deliberation is taking longer than expected.
Dear all, the judges are about to come back. They're discussing and deliberating their verdicts. They'll be back briefly in just 1 minute. All rise.
You may sit down.
Let me start by explaining in a few words why this case is so important. I want to highlight 5 aspects. First, the case illustrates the disastrous consequences of an ideology where the individual and his or her dignity and destiny do not matter. In Nazi Germany, the propagandistic slogan was, "You are nothing, your people are everything." The case shows to which extremes such an ideology may lead. It is not only in the past, but also in the present that such ideologies exist, even if Nazi Germany was the most atrocious example. That is why the inviolability of the dignity of each human being should be the starting point for all legal assessments. Second, the case illustrates white-collar criminal responsibility, more concretely, the responsibility of scientists. They cannot act in an ivory tower and pretend not to be responsible for the consequences of their research, theories, and findings. Third, the non-prosecution of someone who has committed atrocious crimes is an injustice so painfully felt, even by later generations, that it has to be addressed. Even if justice cannot be done anymore, it should be made clear what justice would have required to do. Fourth, even if a crime is committed by many and in many countries, it is still a crime. And fifth, it is true that values and convictions change over time. Nevertheless, there are core values like human dignity and the right to life and to physical integrity that must never be put in question. Before giving a legal assessment of the crimes committed in the case at hand, I want to say a few words on my background. This might help to explain my perspective on the case. I'm German, so I've lived and I live in the country where someone like Mr. Rudin could do what he did. I have to accept that the atrocities committed by him are part of the heritage of my country, and I have to accept that justice was not done in his case as in innumerable other cases. For 9 years, I was the judge elected on behalf of Germany at the European Court of Human Rights. It is almost a miracle that after the Holocaust and after World War II and all the NS crimes committed in the first half of the 20th century, Europe has been able to set up a human rights court functioning for more than 7 decades. Being a human rights judge, I'm not, and I've never been, a criminal judge. I see all cases through the perspective of human rights law. Thus, I see the rights of the victims on the one hand, but I also see the rights of the accused on the other hand. If the European Convention on Human Rights were applied, victims would have the right under Article 2, the right to life, and Article 3, the prohibition of torture. And on the basis of these articles, victims would have the right for perpetrators of crimes against life and physical integrity to be prosecuted and brought to justice. At the same time, the accused would have the right to a fair trial and not to be punished without a legal basis. Now, let me come to the assessment of Mr. Rudin's case based on international criminal law. The prosecution is humanity, so the case is not fixed in time and space. That is an important factor. The prosecution has brought the case against the accused under the Statute of Rome, under the Genocide Convention, and under the Statute of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg. These laws did not exist at the time when, according to the prosecution, the defendant committed his crimes, that is, before 1945. The principle of nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without a law, can be seen as part of the universally recognized principles of law. But this principle allows trial and punishment based on general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. Thus, the Statute of Rome, the Genocide Convention, and the Statute of the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg are applicable insofar as they mirror general principles of law valid already before 1945. The first crime the accused is charged with is incitement to crimes against humanity of murder, extermination, torture, and persecution against an identifiable group or collectivity, here people with disabilities. It has been convincingly shown by the prosecution that the accused acted intentionally, based on deep convictions in supporting the euthanasia and the sterilization program of the Nazi government, in his writings and in his speeches and proclamations. There was a direct causal link between his research and public statements and the enactment of the programs based on those theories. The euthanasia and the sterilization program encompassed the criminal acts of murder, extermination, torture, and persecution against an identifiable group. Accordingly, I find that the accused should be held responsible in respect of charge number 1. The second crime the accused is charged with is incitement to genocide. According to the Genocide Convention, as well as the Rome Statute, genocide has to be committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. It is not, however, related to disabled people. Thus, it cannot be argued that before, or even after 1945, there existed a general principle of law recognized by civilized nations, identifying acts committed against people with disabilities as genocide. Accordingly, the accused cannot be found guilty of incitement to genocide and would have to be acquitted under charge number 2. The third crime the accused is charged with is incitement to, as well as directly causing the crime against humanity of sterilization. Sterilization is to be considered as an act of torture. Thus, what has been said under charge number 1 applies here as well. Accordingly, I find that the accused should also be held responsible in respect of charge number 3. The fourth crime is membership in the criminal organization of the Association of German Neurologists and Psychiatrists. This organization was, as was shown by the prosecution, responsible for the implementation of the euthanasia program. Accordingly, I find that the accused should also be held responsible in respect of charge number 4. Thank you.
Good afternoon to you all. I am Judge Silvia Fernandez de Gurmendi. I'm honored to participate in this trial against Ernst Rudin. The case resonates powerfully with me because of my professional and personal background. I am a former judge of the International Criminal Court and former representative of Argentina, my country, to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA. I have dedicated my entire professional life to promoting justice for victims of atrocity crimes. I am convinced that justice for these crimes must be done at the international or national level, or both. I come from a country that for the last 4 decades has focused on justice as the best way to deal with its own legacy of human rights violations committed during the military dictatorship that ruled the country during the 70s. Following Argentina's return to democracy in 1983, the newly elected government decided to deal with this legacy through memory and justice, and this policy continued to be upheld by all administrations that followed. The main military leaders and many perpetrators have been prosecuted and tried before national courts, and criminal proceedings continue until today, 40 decades after the events. We were then and continue to be convinced today that the prosecution of perpetrators of the gravest crimes is essential to seek the truth, address the harm of victims of past crimes, and to prevent future crimes. Before giving my assessment of the crimes committed in the case we try here, I would like to congratulate all parties and participants for their presentations. You have all greatly contributed to a better understanding of the circumstances and ideas that escalated into heinous acts and ultimately led to the Holocaust. Having listened carefully to all arguments, I am convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Ernst Rudin is guilty on all charges except for the charge of incitement to genocide, for the reasons I will develop further. I would like to focus briefly on 3 crucial arguments raised by the defense. First, according to the defense, Ernst Rudin, who died 70 years ago, cannot be judged through the lens of our current laws and values. Indeed, the principle of legality requires us to judge Mr. Rudin according to the law and values that were applicable at his time, not ours. However, based on the evidence that was presented, including about the public uproar provoked by the killings when they became known, I am convinced that his acts were neither legal nor acceptable at the time of their commission. It is true that the theories advocated by the defendant were not initiated by him and were also endorsed by in many other countries, including here in the United States, where many states had passed sterilization laws. However, Mr. Rudin's culpability is not based only on the theories he upheld, but rather on the concrete actions he promoted to ensure their extreme implementation. This went far beyond forced sterilization, resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, and ultimately paved the way to the Holocaust. Second set of arguments. The defendant cannot be responsible for criminal acts because he held no official position. However, I cannot agree with these arguments. The Nuremberg Tribunal convicted and sentenced to death Julius Streicher, owner of the newspaper Der Stürmer, for his involvement in the Nazi propaganda against the Jews, although he did not hold any administrative position nor harm anyone directly. Mr. Rudin was not part of the state apparatus either, but he exercised leadership in relation to the entire field of psychiatry and racial hygiene. The Society of German Neurologists and Psychiatrists, which he led, became itself a criminal organization, as virtually all members and managing board were directly involved in the execution of the forced sterilization and the so-called euthanasia program. Third set of arguments. The defendant's conduct does not qualify as incitement to genocide because the disabled is not one of the groups included in the applicable definition of genocide. I believe this is correct. As already referred here by Presiding Judge Nussberger, only attacks to destroy national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups may constitute genocide under existing law. Again, based on the principle of legality, an expansion of this law cannot be done by judges, but would require a reform of the Rome Statute. It is therefore not applicable to the defendant. Distinguished participants, today's trial demonstrates the dangerous, slippery road that, starting with discrimination, even in a theoretical form, may escalate to atrocious crimes. Indeed, genocide does not happen overnight. It is the culmination of a long process, which may begin with words, hateful messages, or, as in this case, pseudo-scientific theories to justify discrimination of a group. Considering what we have learned today, it is now up to you to identify any current gaps in national or international law and to seek to promote additional standards as may be necessary to prevent and sanction more effectively any form of prejudice or intolerance.
Thanks to my two honorable colleagues on the bench, and also to the UN officials and our Israeli ambassador for having this moving event here. Special thanks to the father of this gathering, Dr. Avi Omer, and his associate, Sefi Fischler, for their tireless and successful efforts. And finally, last but not least, the young, impressive litigants, prosecution and defense attorneys, and the presenters, kudos to you all. 4 remarks in the beginning. One, it is a very special event it was a very special event when Israel was accepted to the United Nations in 1949, 1 year after its independence, 4 years after the end of the Holocaust. Our people celebrated as our state joined the family of nations. Sadly, over the years, we were deeply disappointed with UN General Assembly resolutions that showed clear double standards. However, we do believe that the UN is an important organization. We still hope for more balanced resolution. The UN has a significant role to play in the areas of health and agriculture, for example, to help a world that needs it, and by the fact that there are now efforts in this organization to fight against anti-Semitism, I am encouraged. My second remark is personal. My father lost almost all his family, parents, sisters, brothers-in-law, nephews, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all shot into a mass grave in their little town in Belarus with all the Jewish inhabitants there on August 14, 1942. About 1,000 Jews from that little shtetl or little township. His brother, my uncle, was killed in Finland as a soldier in the Red Army. My wife's family was sent to Treblinka from Warsaw. Our family is a small part of the 6 million Jewish victims, a third of our people. The names are now presented here in the Book of Names at the UN. This is why I'm proud to have been a justice in the Supreme Court of a Jewish independent state. My third remark relates to the fact that this year we marked 75 years since the acceptance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Its principles are even more valid today. This is added to the other post-World War II treaties, which are the basis of a lot of international humanitarian law nowadays. Former Chief Justice Aaron Barak of the Supreme Court of Israel, a Holocaust survivor as a small child, speaks of two lessons from the Holocaust: the need for a Jewish state, doors of which will be open 7/24 to all Jews, not as before, and human rights, so we shall educate ourselves to respect the other. 1948 is also the year of Israel's independence as a Jewish and democratic state. My fourth remark is on the need to stand up. Almost 7 years ago, I spoke here at the UN in a conference against the BDS, an anti-Semitic movement. I quoted a remarkable poem by German anti-Nazi pastor Martin Niemöller, writing shortly after the Holocaust. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. These strong words speak for themselves. Now to the judgment itself. It is amazing and disappointing that Ernst Rudin escaped indictment in the post-Nazi era and was able to end his life peacefully. How did it happen? Reading the shocking evidence poses this question, indeed shouts the question. And I will not repeat the legal reasons brought by my honorable colleagues. The Shoah was the major Nazi crime. That does not mean that the wicked race ideology did not bear other rotten fruit that may have led to the Shoah, as mentioned before. Euthanasia and the crimes again connected with it, including the evidence of the forced sterilization of 400,000 human beings and the systematic killings of 300,000 human beings, including 10,000 children who were labeled feeble-minded or mentally ill or handicapped, consisted a part of an implementation of the theory for which the defendant was specially responsible. There is no real denial of that supported by documents and even by the speech by the defendant. And beyond there is a slippery slope. What started with euthanasia deteriorated into a much wider dark picture, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and many others, Roma, Gypsies, and other human groups. In particular, in an era of renewed anti-Semitism, it is our sacred duty to remember and never forget. And this mock trial is a good reminder against those human rights violations. The defendant argues concerning eugenics and sterilization that such actions were acceptable in different countries during the Nazi era. After having studied the evidence, I believe this is different in theory and practice. Here we deal with a major murder plan. Whatever scientific packaging and theorizing was using, it is very difficult, indeed unacceptable, to compare it with an American case, albeit bad and puzzling, such as Buck versus Bell. It stands by itself, as in the United States, while sad and totally unacceptable deeds indeed happened, it never developed into a strategy of mass killing, of extermination. I concur with my two colleagues and with their well-written opinions. The main point that distinguishes Rudin and his policy from other countries and their doctors was the translation of the theory into mass implementation, a pathway to the Holocaust. Indeed, he had no official position, but had indirect, direct involvement by training doctors and others to implement the crimes envisioned by him and his colleagues in the Society of German Neurologists and Psychiatrists, many of whom performed the real work. And I agree that genocide, a treaty initiated by a Jewish refugee from Poland, Raphael Lemkin, for legal reasons of interpretation of the Statute of Rome, should not be part of the conviction in the eyes of the criminal law, which insists on the principle of legality. I mentioned before the subject of this trial and Rudin's history and wicked influence are ideologically and practically a part of the Nazi era, the climax of which was the Holocaust. In due diligence, I will say that it is my suggestion that this court will include a German judge, given the specific case, its background and history. In this particular case, Rudin case, Germans were a major part of the victims. The Shoah, of course, consisted mainly of Jewish victims. Humanity made a long way since 1945, both in international and domestic legislation of treaties and laws. And I would like to express the hope, and my two colleagues, in fact, represent their former positions as judges in the international effort for human rights and for criminal conviction of perpetrators. I would like to express the hope that crimes such as Rudin's could not happen today. Regretfully, I'm not sure. There is a bad slippery slope. You begin with a step which may seem innocent, even scientific. You end up with millions of people exterminated. The rise of anti-Semitism and other human rights violations is evident. It should be fought against in all legal means, public, diplomatic, and judicial. I remember when, as cabinet secretary in Israel in 1987, I suggested to Prime Minister Shamir to start monitoring anti-Semitic phenomena, which we were hoping that were suppressed after the Holocaust. Foreign Minister and later President Shimon Peres, a friend, always optimistic, said to me, Eli, governments have to deal with present and future. Anti-Semitism is a remnant of the past. Why deal with it? Sadly, he was mistaken. He later changed his mind. This trial is not for revenge, which is in God's possession. But we can speak of a positive revenge. New generations who rose from the ashes of the Shoah, those who survived, who now have great-grandchildren, and some of them are part of the team here. Having said that, I'm still optimistic that wherever there are perpetrators of crimes under international law, there will be nowadays effort to enforce the law courts. Courts will stand up to the challenge. Finally, the idea to conduct this mock proceeding was indeed right. The educational benefits are very important, self-explanatory. We all have to work against racist occurrences, foreign or domestic, with an eye to the future. Thank you very much.
We thank the honorable judges for the verdict, which they have reached based on the evidence presented before them and you. When we began this afternoon, we pointed out that the trial never happened. What did happen? After the war, Ernst Rudin, considered one of the major figures in German psychiatry, genetics, and eugenics in the first half of the 20th century, appointed in 1931 director of the government-funded Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, claimed that he was a scientist and not a politician, and thus innocent. He was believed, denazified, and classified a nominal party member. The psychiatrist who helped develop the Nazi mass sterilization law and who played a key part in the murder of over 300,000 people deemed unworthy of life, died in retirement in 1952, a free man. It is now my pleasure to hand over the discussion to our moderator, Dr. Tracy Peterson, the manager of the Holocaust and United Nations Outreach Program. Thank you very much.
We are no longer observing the protocols of court, so I'd like to start by just, I'm sure you'll join me, please let us applaud these brilliant young people. We were meant to have a question and answer now, but I think we have enough food for thought to go home and maybe sleep on it a bit. And I do really want to extend my congratulations to everyone that's been involved in this, and to thank, of course, our esteemed judges for giving their time. It really is an example to everyone of putting into action the words that we older people often say about how the youth matter. Here you are illustrating how through your actions you support what young people are doing and thinking. And so I think you will all, yeah. And what a role model you present to all of us, but hopefully to all the young people here who are thinking the law is the place I want to go. You know, human rights, it's a word that rolls off the tongue relatively easily, human rights. It's a really difficult thing, though, because what human rights demands of us is that we don't just do the easy thing, which is to like and love people who look like us, people who speak the same language, who we understand, who can pronounce their names. That's easy. Human rights says you have to afford every human being, by virtue of the fact that they're born, the right to live a life with dignity, with agency. And so I think what today you have reminded us is that we have to constantly ask ourselves, hang on a second, in whose name are we acting? In whose name are we making these decisions? Where does the responsibility lie? Nobody would disagree with the judge's verdict. I think morally, even if you didn't know the law, you would have no difficulty in working out that Ernst Rudin should have been found guilty. But we have to pause. Because when we look at the history, it's very easy sometimes to say, ugh, never do that. That's definitely wrong. Oh, that's terrible. That's not the point. The point is you've got to ask yourself, am I practicing every day? Am I practicing my moral compass every day? Am I looking and holding accountable people who are older than me, my peers, maybe those younger? Because that is how we begin to strengthen a culture of human rights. It's not perfect. We're not being asked to love everybody, but we have to stand firm in the belief that everybody has the right to be treated with dignity. So I'm going to leave you with those words. I want to remind you again, this house, the United Nations, its founding document begins with "We the peoples." We the peoples. So I hope you will come back and visit us again. I hope that some of you will go on to become esteemed judges and contribute to the world in the way that these three people have done. And I hope that you'll get a chance to come and visit us and spend a little time getting to know the United Nations. Find out what it is. We're not a conglomerate. We're made up of member states. How do the member states hold each other accountable? Okay, enough. I think go forth, stay healthy, stay happy, and thank you so much. Of course, there will be time for everybody who has contributed to be thanked. You know who they are. I look at Karen. I look at the directors sitting over there. We think about Jaren. We think about Sefi working over there. And I know I'm leaving people out. But I do want to ask you, please go home and look on your computers. We printed this, a flyer. On your computer sits a PDF document that has every single person here's photograph, their name. It names every person involved in the creative team. So I urge you, that is what you want to send to your friends, to your families. You want to put it up on your whatever page you want to put it up. Because it's going to sit on our United Nations Holocaust Outreach Program page for everyone to see. Okay, now last little thing I have to say. We need to get out of here as quickly as possible. Our wonderful security officers and our people who have been helping, the mics, the lights, they need to go home. So could I please ask you to move as quickly without hurting yourselves up the stairs, into the elevator, and look after yourselves, and you can congregate in the lobby for as long as you like. No, that's not true, but take care. Thank you.